I'd like to welcome you again to today's service of the third Sunday after Epiphany. If anything jumps out at me from today's readings, it's the words of the centurion to Jesus. Lord, I am not worthy that thou mayest come under my roof, but speak only the word, and my servant shall be healed. How many of you can tell me where you first heard those words? How many of you can tell me the context in which you first heard those words, that we associate those words with? It's the rite of communion during the Holy Mass. Before the priest receives communion, he says 3 times, Domine non sum dignus ut intestum tectum meam santantum dic verbo, it's never from a mea. Actually, he says it different. Domine non sum dignus. He says it out loud, then silently, ut intestum tectum meam santantum dic verbo, it's never from a mea. Lord, I am not worthy that thou mayest come under my roof, but speak only the word, and my soul shall be healed. And then, when he turns before giving communion to the people, he says it again. Ecce agnus Dei, ecce qui tollit peccata mundi. Behold the Lamb of God, behold him who taketh away the sins of the world. And again, Domine non sum dignus, while the server rings the bell. What we have here is the image in the centurion's mind of our own perceived unworthiness. And Jesus responds, I have not seen such great faith, even in Israel. Be it done to you as you have asked. So even though the centurion said, non sum dignus, I am not worthy, Jesus said, tu es dignus, thou art worthy. And that becomes a big question. What exactly is worthiness? What is worthiness? What does it mean to be unworthy? To what extent are our conceptions of worthiness and unworthiness a result of brainwashing, whether from church or from our parents or people we associated with? In which case I'm going to call it an inferiority complex or imposter syndrome, which would be the secular equivalents of the concept of unworthiness. And to what extent does God say whether we are worthy or unworthy? And then, finally, as we are spiritual workers and magicians, to what extent does this have anything to do with our magical practice? I find that it has quite a bit, but I'm going to save it. I'm going to save that bridge for when we come to it. The concept of being worthy, the concept of dignus in Latin, that's where the word dignity comes from, dignitas. The word dignity means worthiness. So next time you hear about a dignitary at a special dinner, that's a person who somebody holds worthy to be at that state of being dignified. And the dignify is to make worthy. You see this constellation of words I'm giving out. To be worthy is simply to be acceptable. It is to be, you are acceptable in my sight. When God says you are worthy in my sight, it means you are acceptable. I accept you. You are acceptable. You are worthy of my love when you say somebody is worthy. For example, on the other side of my room, we have company today. Right, we have one of my cats in here, Gray Lady. Hi, Gray Lady. You gonna come up to the camera? No, she's just lying down. She doesn't want to come over. So, there's a very interesting story behind her coming into the home. She lived on my porch for a while. She was the mean cat out there. Any other cat came around, she would chase them away. She was the mean cat. She was the boss of that front porch. But over time, and it's kind of funny because at first we didn't care for each other. But over time, we got to know each other. I put food out for her, and we bonded. Eventually, I brought her in. It's not that she wasn't trying to come in. Anytime I opened the door, she'd try to come in. I know one morning, I take a shower. I come out of the shower. I see her right across the hallway at the cat's water bowl. So now she got into the house. But eventually, and it's not that I didn't like her, it's I had too many cats and didn't really have room to bring her in. But eventually, she grew on me, I grew on her, she came into the house, and now we're inseparable. I wouldn't say I have a familiar, but she is the closest that I would claim to having a familiar. She is worthy. She is acceptable. I love her. She has a lot of my love. And I really wish you'd come up to the camera so I can introduce you to everybody. And she still stays there lying on the floor. Cats, am I right? And the thing is, at no point was she ever unworthy. At no point did I despise her. At no point did I want bad things to happen to her. At no point did I ever see her as unworthy of coming into the house. I simply wasn't able to bring her in. But even when I didn't care for her, I cared for her enough that I wanted her to have a full belly. I put up a shelter that she'd be warm. And so, to me, the concept of worthiness is that she was worthy. And in God's mind, we are all worthy. We are all worthy, preferably of reward. We're worthy of reward. Whether we get that reward depends on us. I know this is starting to sound like a regular Sunday sermon, and that's not the intention, but I want to lay the groundwork for what I'm talking about here. In God's eyes, we are all worthy of His love. Even when we have strayed, even when we, by our own free will, have separated ourselves from Him. And I want to point out that this happens by our own free will. TULIP does not exist. TULIP is an aberration. TULIP, for those who don't know, is Calvin's 5 points. Total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of saints, which means that from the beginning of time, everybody who's going to heaven has been predestined to go to heaven. Everybody who's going to hell is predestined to go to hell, and nothing you think, say, do, or believe is going to change that. In Calvin's mind, God said that so many people are worthy, the rest are unworthy, just so God may glorify Himself. To the point that when it came to Adam eating the fruit of the tree, God actually set that up so He could sneak up behind him and go, "Gotcha!" just so He could be glorified. TULIP is fiction. It does not exist. It is a false doctrine. Because we are all worthy of God's love, even if we separate ourselves from Him. And when we separate ourselves from Him, whether this be by conventional notions of sin or by overtly renouncing Him with our mind and with our lips, what we're really doing is we're unplugging ourselves. All we're doing is we are unplugging ourselves like unplugging a lamp from a wall. Just because you're not plugged in doesn't mean the power source isn't there. All you have to do is plug right back into the wall. Now, plugging back into the wall, I mentioned the purpose of baptism in terms of this. That plugs you into the wall. That plugs you into the current, which is the power flowing through the church. But even outside of that, you can plug in. Because God doesn't just say, only baptize Christians who remain in good standing. More to the point, only baptize Catholics who remain in good standing are worthy. No, all people are worthy. That's why there's baptism of blood and baptism of desire. You plug yourself back in. You clean yourself from the illusions that you may have. You clean yourself from whatever deeds that you've done. It's called penitentiam agite, doing penance. But you clean yourself. You purify yourself. And magical rites have so much to do with purification because they operate on the same principle. Even if it's so much as doing an LBRP morning and evening, it's operating on a similar principle of purification to plug yourself back into the source. And it's not just purification rites. It's morning and evening prayer. Like the morning and evening adoration and other systems. You're plugging yourself back in. First, the contacts. I wish I had a plug here so I could use it for a visual demonstration. The contacts on the plug may have some dirt. You get rid of the dirt that's encrusted on them. And then plugging it back in and getting that to flow. In which case you become aware of your own worthiness. You become aware of it. But but not in such a way that it goes to your head. Because if it goes to your head, that goes to something else we're about to talk about. So worthiness is your ability to have that current of God's power and God's love flow through you. And power and love must always be kept together. Never one without the other. Right? We've talked about this before. Always together. So that's the basic concept of worthiness. So let's talk about the conception of worthy versus unworthy. A lot of what we consider unworthiness, like I mentioned, is brainwashing that we get. Brainwashing from childhood. A pastor might say, God's got it out for you. There was a puritanical sermon from the 18th century, I think, where the minister preached, and this was a footnote to the Crucible, that's where I first found it, that God holds you like a spider over a flame, waiting to burn you. What image are you going to get there? Complete unworthiness. Or we have talk about our sinful nature, my sinful and unworthy nature. St. Teresa of Avila peppers this throughout her writings, especially the interior castle. How she's frail and unworthy. Yet she was such a conduit for God's power and love in the world. In fact, she was the first woman to be named Doctor of the Church. And she and her confessor, St. John of the Cross, they pretty much dominate Catholic spirituality. The two Carmelites who dominate Catholic spirituality. She was more than worthy in God's eyes. But she always held herself to be unworthy. This is conditioning that we have. In secular terms, this conditioning works itself through inferiority complexes or imposter syndrome. I never think I'm going to be good enough. I never think I'm going to be good enough. For example, a week ago, I had a phone conversation with a gentleman. He spent 8 years working off and on to get his Master's of Divinity degree. And he told me that he doesn't feel like it's good. He spent 8 years. He had a problem getting jobs afterwards, student loans out the wazoo. But he's going to go right back to school to get his doctorate because he doesn't feel his MDiv is good enough. It's more than good enough. It's more than good enough for the job you're doing. But what this is not feeling good enough. So you're pushed to do something more. You're pushed to do something more and more and more, even if it's at your own peril. That's the inferiority complex. That's the imposter syndrome, feeling like you're faking it until you make it. You want to know something? I feel like I'm not good enough. I read some of the posts that people write. I read other people's books. There is no way I could ever aspire to the heights of some of what I'm seeing. I'm not an intellectual. I'm not an academic. I'm a pastor and I'm a popularizer. And in many ways, I feel like I am intellectually not good enough. But for some reason, people like what I'm saying. And I thank you for it. I thank you for tuning in. But it just goes to say we each have a cross to bear. We each have a way in which we feel that we are unworthy. And if you search inside of yourself, you'll find something about yourself that you're not happy with either, or that you feel you could be better. Me? I may feel I'm not good enough in certain areas, in which case I attempt to apply myself. I attempt to make it such. But even then, there will always be something else. But that doesn't matter to God. And to a certain extent, that doesn't matter in your magical practice. Leonardo asks, at what point exactly does that separate from humbleness? Like starts to become a bad thing. I'm glad you asked, Leonardo, because I'm actually going to talk about this in a few minutes. I'm just going to ask that you hold on and bear with me. And Kathy says, you show your readers / audience that you appreciate them. That makes a big difference. Well, Kathy, I show you I appreciate you because I do appreciate you. It's just that simple. I do appreciate you. I am super grateful for each and every one of you. In fact, I'm so grateful for each and every one of you that's why I want to tell you this. This is beyond just saying the message of God's love. This is also the message of God's power. And also the context in which we should talk about the fear of God. The fear of God, which is the beginning of wisdom. So, in the gospel, Jesus also tells us, I tell you that many will come from the east and the west and will sit down with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the sons of the kingdom will be thrown out into the outer darkness. There will be weeping and the gnashing of teeth. What is Jesus talking about there? What is Jesus talking about there? Who are the sons of the kingdom that will be thrown out into the outer darkness? In context, I haven't seen this great faith in Israel. The sons of the king will be thrown into outer darkness. On a superficial level, he's talking about the Jews. And he's saying that the Gentiles will come from east and west to sit down with Abraham. On a superficial level. But what he's actually talking about are attitudes that existed within the Jewish community. In fact, they're attitudes that exist amongst us moderns as well. I'm going to refer you to elsewhere in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 3. I'm reading this from the Dewey Confraternity version. Okay, chapter 3, we begin at verse 7. But when John the Baptist saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees coming to his baptism, he said to them, Brood of vipers, who has shown you how to flee from the wrath to come? Bring forth therefore fruit benefiting repentance, and do not think to say within yourselves, We have Abraham for our father. For I say to you that God is able out of these stones to raise up children to Abraham. Basically what the saying is, do not say we're of the chosen people, therefore we're okay. God has chosen us, therefore we are okay. And this goes back to what I talked about on the fourth Sunday of Advent. Every mountain shall be made low, every valley shall be made filled. Mountains low, valleys filled. All are treated and viewed equally in God's sight. You cannot presume salvation. That's a message for modern evangelicals, for that matter, or for modern fundamentalists. You can't, that once saved, always saved is false. That's what the Pharisees and Sadducees were saying in here. In fact, Luke also tells a story in chapter 3. I'm giving Matthew's version because it's a little bit more detailed. You cannot presume salvation. That was a mentality amongst the Jewish community that Jesus was talking to. The sons of the kingdom. The people who believe that just because we belong to this group of people, we don't have to worry because we have the law. We don't have to worry about repentance or any of that stuff. Well, yes you do. And in fact that goes back 200 years before John the Baptist or Jesus. In the book of Ecclesiasticus, in modern Bibles this is the book of Sirach, chapter 5, starting at verse 4. Do not say, I have sinned, yet what has befallen me? Because the Lord bides his time. Do not be overconfident of forgiveness, adding sin upon sin. Do not say, great is his mercy, he will forgive my many sins. For mercy and anger alike are within him. Upon the wicked, his wrath lights upon the wicked. So, Leonardo asked, at what point does a conception of unworthiness depart from humbleness? Likewise, at what point does a conception of worthiness turn into pride? False pride, to be specific. That right there is Jesus' own answer. Those who assume they will be saved. In fact, the man who wrote the book of Ecclesiasticus was also named Jesus. It was a pretty common name in the Middle East. Yeshua or Yeshua. It was a common name. If you presume your faith, if you presume your salvation, if you presume that you'll be saved, whether because you accepted Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior, or because God chose your ancestors, so you have to be part of that group descended from said ancestor, it's still a sin of presumption. That's what Catholic moral theology calls it, the sin of presumption. I presume, therefore I do not have to do the work. And that right there is a sin of pride. It's saying, I am too good to be I am too good to have to do the work. I am too good to have to mind my own business. I am too good to have to mind my manners. I am too good to have to mind my relationship with God. Because that's for plebs, that's for the unsaved, that's for the unwashed, that's for the unregenerate, that's for the unchosen, that's for the uninsert adjective here. And the moment you cross that line into pride, the moment you cross the line into egotism or megalomania, that right there is the moment when you become a child of wrath. That is the moment when you become unworthy. You become unworthy. You're not unworthy of God's love, but you do become unworthy of the reward. Because the minute you do that, remember, how you see God reflects how you see your neighbor. How you see your neighbor reflects how you see God. The minute you cross into pride and megalomania is the moment you start seeing your neighbor as less than. You separate yourself from love of neighbor. And in doing so, you separate God from your love. Because the image of God is in your neighbor just as the image of God is within you. There's a tightrope balance that has to be walked here. Because some people are better off not being associated with. It could be certain behaviors that they're into. It could be certain ways of thinking that can just drag you down. There are some people you're better off not associating with. It doesn't mean you love them any less. It doesn't mean you see them as any less a creation of God. It just means they have issues that they need to work out. And until they work out those issues, you have to protect yourself from any fallout they may bring upon themselves because of those issues. These are the types of decisions we have to make all throughout our life and all throughout all our personal relationships. And so, that right there, that going off into pride, for those of you who follow modern Hermetic Kabbalah, this would be the vice of Tiferet, false pride. It would be the work of the 25th path in order to cleanse yourself of that vice. But that right there is a thing. It is not about seeing your in-group as superior, the children of the kingdom, those who saw themselves as superior because they were the children of Abraham, versus all those Gentiles, Goyim, Nokrim, and so on, practicing their Avodah Zarah, that therefore they are not worthy because they're not the children of Abraham. That's a superiority complex. And that is why those who have that mentality, not all Jews of our time, I'd recommend the works of Rabbi Menahem Kellner in reference to that, and Rabbi Chaim Balk in reference to this, but not all Jews of our time, not all Jews of Jesus' time believed that. But for those who did believe that, and the same can be said for any Gentile who believed that they themselves, whether because of their chosen race or their chosen cultus or whatever, that they were superior to all others. It's an in-group versus out-group balance. There is an in-group versus out-group. All humans are wired to have in-group preference. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with benefits to the in-group that the out-group doesn't get. But it does not mean that a member of the out-group is ontologically or inherently inferior because they belong to an out-group. It doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean that God does not love them. It doesn't mean that they don't qualify for God's love or God's salvation. And that right there is the mystery of worthiness and unworthiness. How do you view God? How do you treat yourself? And how do you treat your neighbor? And I really think, just as last week I referred to the epistle as the egg that held the meatloaf of the gospel together, I think Paul captures this in the first sentence of today's epistle. Do not be wise in your own conceits. Do not set up all these ideas and ideologies and nestle your brain inside of them like a cozy to where you never get out of it. You never break out of it. You never break out of your own ideological chamber, your ideological prison. That's being wise in your own conceits. Rather than being wise in your own conceits, look for what others have to say. Look for others have to teach you. Repay no one evil for evil. Respect what is honorable in the sight of all. Look at what is good. One of the few things Vatican II said that I agree with. The Catholic Church rejects nothing of what is holy and good in other religions. I forget if that was Gaudium et Spes or Lumen Gentium that said it. But others have things to teach us. Look at what can be taught. Look at what we can find as good. Just as I said, for example, TULIP is fiction. I called TULIP a false doctrine. Yet the tradition that gave us TULIP, the Calvinists, represented in this country mostly through the Presbyterians and through a number of Baptist churches that combine Calvinist with Anabaptist doctrine. Okay, the Calvinists, they may have a false doctrine in TULIP, but they have a good practice in the concept, in the conception of being faithful to one's responsibilities and negotiating one's personal relationship, and a very good idea in what they call the principle of participation and the limitation of power, which is effectively the basis for the system of governing by consent of the governed found in the U.S. Constitution. So, just because somebody has a teaching that's bad does not mean that they don't have something that's good also. We can look and find good everywhere just as we can find bad everywhere. The question is, are you looking for one or the other? Or are you having a balanced mind to look for both? I would leave you with that thought, but I want to talk, how does this affect us as magicians and occultists and magic users and spiritual workers and all that kind of good stuff? It affects us because when you get so caught up in pride and your head is stuck up your rear end, remember what I said last week, love is getting your head out of your ass. Well, when your head is stuck up your rear end, you're so caught up on this megalomania and this fluff bunny nonsense, here's what's going to happen. First, you're not going to do the work. And becoming proficient is about doing the work. That's what separates occultism from a culture. You might want to do the work, but then you find, you know what? I don't really like the negative place where this meditation leads me. I should be meditating on my own sinfulness. I should meditate on my own worthiness instead. Well, so you don't have an examination of conscience. So what happens is this. You decide to cut and paste an examination of conscience out of your disciplines. And then you copy-paste, say, some love and light meditation from another source. And you know, the New Age is all about copy-pasting, cutting, pasting, dragging, and dropping, to put it into computer terms. The New Age is, fluff bunnyism is. So what happens is you drag and drop something else. So you're no longer being aware of your negative qualities. You're turning a blind eye to them, and they can grow. You're creating a fantasy world where you are positive, you're wonderful, you're this excellent person. When in reality, you're not dealing with your negative qualities. Two things happen. First, you stagnate in the work that you're doing. Second, because you're turning a blind eye to your negative qualities, other entities who, some could have malicious intent, some might just want entertainment, they will look at these qualities and they will exploit them and use them against you. You become the plaything for other entities that you would ordinarily not want anything to do with. So that's a twofold trap right there. That's not everything that can happen, but I think that's enough to explain. Now, suppose you're copy-pasting all these disciplines and allowing yourself to become self-deceived, but you want to be a grimoire magician. You start evoking entities. You start interacting with entities. What's going to happen there? You become more easily deceived because you no longer know yourself. And if you don't know yourself, then you don't love yourself. Instead, this I'm a wonderful person illusion makes you in love with a false image of yourself, but not your real self. That sets you up for an even bigger fall. And third, how do you know that any communications you're getting are not just in your head? Now, Theophilus says people will know when the qualities are fake in you too. People are not stupid. Now, for everybody else, that's actually a phone conversation that we had earlier today. Because yes, like when you're out there, if you're doing videos or if you're presenting or teaching classes or even just talking to somebody one-on-one, people are a lot more intuitive than most of us give them credit for. People know if you're fake. People know if you're being real. Now, yeah, it is possible for somebody to fake it very well. But sooner or later, those people will get caught and those people will collapse under their own weight. Or at least under the weight of whatever storm they created. But yes, people do know, and what they don't know, they will eventually find out. Truth will come up to the surface. Now, the thing is this, though. People may be good at being intuitive and diagnosing you. And Alex says, the pride of the magician, one of the deadliest sins of the Faust legend. Great point, Agostino. Really enjoying this. Thank you very much, Alex. I enjoy your podcast too. Hey, if you guys aren't familiar with the Glitch Bottle podcast, go check Alex out. And I'm not just saying that because I've been on there twice, but seriously, go check him out. Go check out his work. Excellent. Okay, and that right there is the thing. You fall in love with the false image of yourself, and even if other people can intuitively know, you yourself may not know. You yourself may not know, and so you yourself set yourself up to fall into a massive trap. And that, again, is unworthiness. You fall into the sin that makes you unworthy of the eternal reward. You can end up accelerating that pain, whether temporally or eternally, when you start practicing magic with that mentality. And this is what's so dangerous about many things that are taught in the New Age movement. I know when I was around the New Age movement, like say in the 80s, they had a more balanced mindset about it. Because you need to work on your negatives and your positives. But you need to acknowledge your negatives are there. I've seen this with amongst fluff bunnies, some of whom tend to be what I call empty-headed arrogance. I mean, there's an arrogance where you at least have some background, some foundation on which somebody could say it's justified. There's an empty-headed arrogance where you got nothing, but you're talking to people like they're less than you anyway. And as a magician, these are things you need to look out for. I have said over and over that while the exoteric person in the pews has so much luxury when it comes to this, you and I, we don't have that luxury. We do not have the luxury of ignoring what's inside of ourselves. We don't have the luxury of turning a blind eye to our negative qualities. We don't have the luxury of not doing the work. Because we are interacting with this other universe. We are interacting with these other levels of reality. And you need to know yourself before you can know reality. You need to know your biases. You need to know your prejudices. You need to know your areas of ignorance. You need to know your areas of intelligence. You need to know. Without which you will fall. You will fall the fall of Lucifer, who thought more for himself than he really was. He thought he was more intelligent than he actually was. He thought he was more powerful than he actually was. And he tried to grasp the throne. Non serviam. I shall not serve. He tried to grasp the throne by force, and he was thrown down. You will become a little Lucifer. And not in the good way. It's a generic Lucifer. It's a generic Latin term, just meaning light bearer. Jesus is called Lucifer during the exalted hymn in the Eastern Vigil, as in the bringer of light, not like the fallen angel. But you'll become a little Lucifer, as in a little fallen angel, because of your ignorance and your pride, if you attempt to practice magic on any serious level without first clearing it out. I'm going to leave you on this note because I think I've hammered my point well into the ground by now. I've hammered it into the ground. I hope I haven't elaborated over much, and I hope I haven't hammered it too much into your heads, because that's for you to do to yourselves.